Well, hi class, how you doing? It's great to see you. Great to be with you by video. And I want to talk to you in this video and perhaps the next one on spirit movements as movements of protest. Pentecostalism challenges us to consider the development of the doctrine of pneumatology from the perspective of the experienced movements of the Holy Spirit. And when we look for these kinds of movements, we find them primarily in movements of protest within the history of the church. At times, they're reactions to the institutionalization of the church itself. At other times, they're movements of social protest, political protest against the larger socio-political context in which they're found. And in order to understand these movements, I want to place them within the context of that great German sociologist of religion, Max Weber. And then we'll take a look at a few of these movements in history. So first, let's talk about Weber and the routinization of the charisma. A long time ago, Max Weber claimed that charismatic movements arise under shaman-like leaders with magical properties. He contended that if this is not to remain a purely transitory phenomenon, that is, this religion or this movement, if it's not to remain a purely transitory phenomenon, but to take on the character of a permanent relationship forming a stable community of disciples, it is necessary for the character of charismatic authority to become radically changed. Now, the danger is that when we move from the temporary or the immediate to transitory to a more permanent structure, that it loses the very power that caused it to become an explosive spiritual movement in the first place. But Weber talks about this process and he calls it the routinization of the charisma. Now, in the 20th century, an American sociologist named Margaret Paloma suggested that this Weberian model of the routinization of the charisma applies remarkably well to Pentecostalism as a movement of spiritual renewal. What she said was that the growth that she perceived in the Assemblies of God, which is the largest white Pentecostal denomination to arise out of Azusa, she credited that growth to the fact that the AG successfully encouraged, quote, personal participation in the charisma without jeopardizing its organizational structure. In other words, they had managed to somehow routinize the charisma. Organization, institutionalization had seemed to happen, and she's writing at that point at the end of the 80s, seemed to happen without betraying the very movement of the Spirit that caused the explosive growth of the assemblies. Another famous sociologist of religion, David O. Moberg, in his treatment of the life cycle of the church, reiterates the traditional four stages in the life cycle of religious bodies. These four stages include cult, sect, denomination, and church. And according to Moberg, the cult is a small, loosely structured, self-centered, and different. The sect is still small, claims to have the only answer, is anti-status quo, differentiates itself from the rest of the religious world, and often suffers persecution. The denomination, he says, is something larger. It's more liberalized and institutionalized, and it tolerates and is tolerated. And the church, he suggests, is even larger, conservative, bureaucratic, broad in its approach, and extremely influential in society. And so the question is, where do Pentecostal denominations or Pentecostal groups fit in this fourfold kind of orientation? Which are we? Now, two major stages in the life cycle of the church may be distinguished. The first begins with the inception of the church, by the declarations of the founder and the acceptance of his claims by a group of followers. Sociologically, this represents a revolt against the prevailing order and therefore a social movement. The newly formed group is ordinarily a minority group subject to persecution from the ruling majority, and so it forms a closely knit esprit de corps and a high degree of cohesiveness. For the followers, the founder is generally a charismatic figure, a messenger of God gifted with the Holy Spirit, and thus an extraordinary, superhuman, holy, and sacred being who is adored and obeyed and whose will is carried out by his devotees unconditionally and unquestioningly. But with the passing of the founder, now there's an opportunity for transition. With the passing of the original charismatic figure, one of two things happens. A successor may be explicitly and unquestionably appointed by the founder, in which case the appointed successor inherits and carries a certain amount of the charisma of the founder. But sooner or later, the second thing happens. The succession is subject to the termination or modification. And with the termination of succession, the charismatic period is over, and the second major period of a religion begins. That is a period that's as long as the life cycle of the religion itself. And during this time, the religion is institutionalized, or in Weber's term, the charisma is routinized. Now, the routinization of the charisma is one of the most significant, critical parts in the life cycle of a religion. Almost all major religions of the past have suffered during this transition. The main problems are those of succession, institutionalization, stratification, and bureaucratization. That such a process took place at all among Pentecostals is even more remarkable, considering that early Pentecostals had really strong attitudes towards denominationalism. In fact, the founding general superintendent of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, George Chambers, recalled as he was retiring in 1934 that before 1917, he says, we took the position that God was forever through with organization. However, with a little bit of reflection, he says, after years of battling along, each man for himself, some calling it the faith life, seeing and doing some quite foolish things, we finally woke up to the fact that some order and system was needed and right. Institutionalization had begun, and the immediacy that marked early Pentecostal interpretation would have to undergo some kind of alteration to accommodate this newly institutionalized Pentecostalism. Now, historically, from Montanism in the 2nd century and onwards, it appears that movements related to the Holy Spirit have been interpreted as movements of social protest. Now, there's a fascinating line of these spirit movements throughout the history of the church, and often they've been labeled by their detractors as heretical. Maybe it would be better to think of them not so much as heretical as thinking of them as heterodox. And I want to make this distinction because I think it's an important distinction. Heterodoxy is a term for those who deviate from the received tradition, but still may not have moved to the place of heresy. Heresy, on the other hand, is teaching that is so at variance with the tradition as to be inconsistent with it. So these groups, these movements of the Spirit, have certain characteristics in common. They're characterized by a significant degree of autonomy, a democratization of the faith, makes it so that everyone can experience the Spirit. Experience of the Spirit is open to all participants. But there's also, on the other hand, a kind of shamanism that makes the most ecstatically or charismatically gifted individual into the most powerful individual in the group. There's a prioritization, therefore, of experience over doctrine. And often in these groups, there are two other things that kind of go hand in hand. An extreme apocalyptic expectation, that is, the end is coming, Jesus is returning. And on the other hand, a real strong sense of perfectionism, that is, the potential to climb, a spirituality of ascent, if you will. And so we're not looking here for a development of the doctrine of the Holy Spirit so much as we are possibly an explanation of the lack of development of that doctrine among spirit movements. Because after all, in a group of people that are looking to experience the Spirit, the experience is much more important than the doctrine. I'm going to come back in a few moments and we're going to talk about spirit movements themselves.